Well, hello everyone who is part of this amazing Live 58 Church movement where we want to serve our community and one another in safe, servant-focused ways. So excited that I can join you here for a few minutes. I want to talk about just the process of change. The process of change, whether it's personal change or whether it's changing our community. Change is hard. So what I want to do is I want to share with you a story. They say that metaphors and stories are the best way that we as humans learn. So I want to tell you a story, and it's a story about change. And it's kind of the process of change. It's a familiar story. It's a story familiar to some of you if you grew up in church. It's about King Nebuchadnezzar in 605 BC who defeats the Jews. He's the Babylonian king, and he captures all the smartest and young men who are future leaders. And they're trying to brainwash them to worship Babylonian gods. And so King Nebuchadnezzar builds a 90-foot tall golden statue of himself to be worshipped. And so he calls all the magistrates and all the politicians to this big ceremony. And there are a bunch of different men who are Jews who've been captured, smart guys, and three of them are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, three of the coolest names in the world. How come nobody calls anybody Shadrach, Meshach, or Abednego anymore? I mean, those are just cool names, but these were three Jews who were trying to be brainwashed, and so they're at this ceremony. And at this ceremony, the king says, listen, I need everybody, when the music starts, to bow down and worship this golden idol. And if you don't, we've got a fiery furnace, and it's hot, and we will throw you in the fiery furnace if you do not bow down. So here's the crisis, because change usually happens because there's a crisis. We all have crises. We're in a crisis right now in our world with this pandemic. We have personal crisis. We also look in our community and our world, and we know that there are all types of crises. The crisis of poverty, the crisis of aloneness, the crisis of just people needing hope. And we know as a Live 58 church that in the crisis in our world, that as the hands and feet of God, that we can be that change. And through that crisis, we can bring hope. But crisis is one of those things that nobody really wants. We don't like crisis. Henry Kissinger once said this. I love this. He says, there cannot be a crisis next week. My schedule is already full. How many of us, our schedules are too full to have a crisis? Well, crises are inevitable. And it's human nature in a crisis to do one of two things, to either look for simple, comfortable solutions, or to just ignore the crisis because it's too overwhelming. The Chinese have two brush strokes for the word crisis. The first brush stroke it represents danger, and the second brush stroke represents opportunity. I want you to think about crisis. It is dangerous. It wouldn't be a crisis if there wasn't danger involved, but crisis always brings opportunity. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were fully aware of the crisis, the danger of the crisis. If they don't bow down, they're going to get thrown into the furnace. If you're familiar with the story, what they did was they ended up not bowing down, and they told the king respectfully, hey, listen, we're just not going to bow down. We're just not. We only worship our God, the true God. And so respectfully, we're not trying to be disrespectful, but we're willing to be thrown into the furnace in this crisis. You see what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had, which is leading to true change, is through the crisis, they had a conviction. These are all C words, by the way. So through a crisis brings hopefully a conviction. Nothing significant, nothing great happens in this world without a conviction to see something change. In fact, what do we say all the time? Many of you watching this, you know what we say. We say, God, break our hearts for the things that breaks your heart, for the orphan, for the foster child, for the lonely widow or widower, for the person hungry. That breaks God's heart. Let there be that deep conviction. Break our hearts for the things that breaks yours, because it's only through and by those of us who are the hands and feet of Jesus where change will really happen. But deep conviction on its own doesn't really change anything without it moving to a commitment to do something. Thomas Carlyle said this. He said, conviction is worthless unless it's converted into commitment. I don't know about you, but there's been I get convicted about a lot of things, but many times I'm not willing to take the step to commitment, to be committed to seeing change happen. You know, when it comes to the church, in the church world, there's a lot of people week in and week out, and there's a conviction, and we know this through Isaiah 58, that the true fast is to serve and to feed the hungry and to break the chains of injustice. And we know we're convicted by Jesus saying, you know, when you've done it unto the least of these, you've done it unto me. But that conviction needs to move to a commitment to do something. These three boys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, had a conviction, but it led more to just a conviction, because there were others in that place that probably had the conviction not to bow either. But it led to a powerful commitment. And the commitment was, even if God does not save us, we will not bow. We will not serve your gods. When conviction turns into a commitment, powerful things begin to happen. But there's another C. With a crisis comes a conviction. We need to take the step to make a commitment, and then we hope. We hope with that commitment that we were willing to count the cost, because there will be costs. There will be a cost in committing. With the Live 58 Church and with our own lives, spiritual lives, we know what God asks of us, our time, our talents, and our treasures. It will cost us something. Ken Blanchard said this. He said, there's a difference between interest and commitment. When you're interested in something, you do it only when it's convenient. When you're committed to something, you accept no excuses, only results. Man, I just pray that's what I want to be. In this season that God is planting Live 58 Church in Orangeville and then possibly other places, God's asking me and you and all of us to count the cost. I have found myself, though, many times in life living between the line of conviction and commitment, because I know there's a cost. And Jesus, he was obvious. He said, hey, you're going to have to count the cost, because we know there's a cost. Those of you watching this, you know there's a cost. Now, we know there's great rewards, but there's a cost. There's a cost to ending poverty. There's a cost to fighting injustice. There's a cost to working on your marriage. There's a cost to overcoming addiction. There's a cost to sponsoring a child halfway around the world. There's a cost always to change, to surrendering our life to God. There will always be a cost, and with that cost comes consequences. You might lose friends. You might miss out on some temporary pleasures. You might be unpopular. You might have to simplify your life. You might risk looking a fool. You might risk failure. For the three Jewish boys, the consequences were potential death. That was going to be the consequence. You know, as a child, I loved the story, but I think I love it more now when it comes to thinking about really being a change-making church, having my own life being about making change. Let me tell you the rest of the story. The boys don't bow. The king gives them another chance. The boys don't bow. They get thrown into the fiery furnace, and there they meet an angel. They don't get burned. The king sees all of this and orders them to come back out, and the boys don't even smell like smoke. And the crisis that exposed these three boys to a conviction that turned into a commitment, who were willing to count the costs, face the consequences, led to an amazing change in the king that not even Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego could have ever imagined. Because the boys were willing to go through the change process, crisis to conviction to commitment to cost, counting the cost to facing the consequences, the king had a 180 degree change. The king then declares this because he sees the miracle of the boys. He says, if anybody bows down, you got to bow down to their God, to Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego's God. And if I see anybody bowing down to this golden idol, I'm going to tear you limb from limb and burn your house down. Now, the king had discovered God, but he had not quite discovered grace and how to live out that grace with other people. He was a work in progress. I want to say this. I want to say, again, in this pandemic and where you're at, personally, maybe with family, being a part of a Live 58 church is, we really don't have a lot of control of change. But what we do have is we have control over the process. God takes care of the rest. If I'm willing to look at a crisis and to be convicted that this isn't right, that something needs to change, and I'm willing to make a commitment and count the costs and face the consequences, God will make amazing changes. I think about that. I think about the adrenaline rush of these three boys who went through that process all the way to facing the consequences. The adrenaline of being alive, seeing that miracle and seeing the king change. What an adrenaline. And that's the joy that God talks about. That's the joy of serving him, even through tough times. Then I think about some of the other people in that crowd who bowed, and they lived too. But they didn't have the joy of being part of the miracle. Yeah, they survived, but they didn't get to be a part of God's own work. In the words of Ken Blanchard, they were interested, but not committed. Well, let me wrap this up. And I just hope this is an encouragement to you today, tonight, whenever you're watching this. But Ken Blanchard said they were interested, but not committed. But when we commit, friends, God can do amazing things. One of my all-time favorite quotes, Margaret Mead said this: "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has." There's a small core group of us, probably about 30 couples and single people. Maybe it adds up to about 60, 70 people right now. And we see the crisis. We see the crisis of the church needing to be relevant again, to be able to go out and really serve the most vulnerable, the wounded, the hurting, to go into neighborhoods and create safe spaces for people to discover the grace of God. We see the crisis. And I know we all have this conviction, and I just pray God will help us to take the step to commit to this, to count the costs with our time, talents, and treasures, and maybe the consequences of what that looks like, because I believe we're going to see true change. Isaiah 58, we think of Isaiah 58, the chapter, being about God reprimanding the Jews for playing religious games rather than caring about the poor, and that's true. But in the end, most of the chapter is about the promises that come. The promises that he will light our paths, that he will be our rear guard, that he will bless us and walk with us. And we will be known. We will be known as rebuilder of walls and repairer of cities. That's where the real joy comes. So, let me just close with this. We're serving a God who followed this example. You see, at the beginning of creation, there was a crisis. Sin had separated us from God, but God had a deep conviction. He loved the world so much that he made a commitment to send his one and only son, and the cost was the torture and death of his one and only son. And the consequences were that for 2 days, Satan thought he had won. But change happened on that third day, when his one and only son rose from the dead, defeated death once and for all. His blood covers our sin. We are free. We are free to live and to serve. He took our punishment, and now his mercy and grace rules, and we are born again into eternal life. Thank you guys for letting me share. Be blessed. We'll all be talking soon, but you are in our prayers. Thank you so much for being a part of this amazing change and this amazing movement. God bless you, and we'll see you soon.